Hi gang, here is a short video on oligopoly behavior and the prisoner's dilemma. We have two criminals, Capone and Dillinger, who robbed a bank. Now, the prisoner's dilemma matrix is usually made up of 4 quadrants like this, with the simple prisoner's dilemma. Okay, if Al Capone here, Capone is in blue, he's on the top, Capone is on the top, he has 2 options. He can either confess or not confess. Maybe he doesn't confess. And Dillinger, who is to the left and on the bottom, represented by the white triangle, also has the same options, to confess or not to confess. So, if Capone confesses, okay, this is Capone, and he chooses to confess, this is Capone's confession column. What is Dillinger's best option in this column? Well, Dillinger can choose to confess, or he can choose not to confess. If he confesses, he will get 10 years, and if he does not confess, and Capone does confess, he will get 30 years. What is the best option for this column? Obviously, it's 10 years. So I'm going to leave that there because now we're going to take a look at the next column for Capone, which is that he does not confess. So if Capone doesn't confess, what is Dillinger's best option in this column? Well, Dillinger could choose to confess, and in that case he only gets 2 years because Capone is choosing not to confess. This is Capone's not to confess column. Or Dillinger could choose, also like Capone, not to confess. Well, what is the best option here? The best option here is obviously 2 years. Okay, so if we take a look at Dillinger's choices, either to confess or not to confess, his dominant strategy is obviously to confess. He's better off in both cases, regardless of what Capone does. And here's the definition of a dominant strategy: a strategy that is best for a player in a game, regardless of the strategies chosen by other players. So, Dillinger, his dominant strategy, regardless of what Capone does, is to confess. So in both cases, regardless of what Capone chooses, Dillinger will always confess, and therefore Dillinger's strategy is to confess. Now, let's take a look at Capone. I'm going to leave Dillinger's dominant strategy up there, and let's take a look at what Capone will want to do depending upon what Dillinger does. If Dillinger confesses, Capone has 2 options. He can either choose to confess, the same as Dillinger, or he can choose not to confess, different than Dillinger. Well, if he chooses to confess, he only gets 10 years. But if he chooses not to confess, while Dillinger confesses, he gets 30 years. So what is Capone's best option in this row? His best option is to confess. So now let's take a look at the row where Dillinger chooses not to confess. So if Dillinger doesn't confess, what is Capone's best option in this row? Dillinger is not confessing. Capone could choose to confess, and he gets 2 years, or he can choose not to confess, and he gets 5 years. Well, obviously, Capone is best off in this row if he chooses to confess. So Capone's dominant strategy, which is a strategy that is best for a player in a game regardless of the strategies chosen by other players, is to confess. So in this case, in both cases, regardless of what Dillinger chooses, Capone always does best to confess. Therefore, Capone's dominant strategy is to confess. And so now we are at a Nash equilibrium. What is a Nash equilibrium? A Nash equilibrium is a concept within game theory where the optimal outcome of a game is that the 2 players have no desire to move because they will be worse off.